Hello everybody, welcome back to High Ground. My name is Tanner, and today we're going to be ranking the top 15 players within EU. And I'm not necessarily doing it for right now. The period I'm looking at goes back about a year and a half to stage 1 of 2022, everything up through the Copenhagen Major, which was the most recent official Tier 1 event. So 20 players picked out here. 5 of them are going to be unordered within honorable mentions, then we'll get into the top 15. And I'm going to be referring to stats a lot of the time, so let me show you what I'm working with here. If you want to screenshot this thing or whatever, if you want to pause and maybe evaluate who you think should be some of the top players, this is what I'm working with. Pretty much every player is going to be in the about in the top half here that I have within the top 15, but I'll scroll down and show you these are all of the players that played in the most recent stage of EUL. So maybe some of them won't be playing in the future, but they did. And okay, let's go back to the tier list here. I'm not going to show that again. I'm just going to have that off on another monitor for me to reference. So starting with the honorable mentions, I have a couple of ex-Empire players, now Virtus Pro players, Shepard and Dan. We will have one Virtus Pro player on the list proper, but I think the team didn't show up as expected at the Copenhagen Major. That's a big reason they didn't make it, and none of the players really showed up very well except for Joystick, who, spoiler, is still up here. Dan and Always have played a little bit more since returning to T1 than Shepard and Joystick have. And Dan's done pretty well within the regular stages, but not within the other stuff. Shepard's been okay, but he is the hard support IGL player, so I think that makes sense. Had they made it to the top 8, maybe I'd give the IGL, aka Shepard, a little bit more credit, but they kind of missed out. And if they make another major and have a decent performance within EU, obviously, if they make the major, they will have put up a decent performance within EU. Maybe they'll move into the top 15 proper, but because they haven't been playing in T1 again, consecutively, even though they are very storied, very legendary Hall of Fame players, I'm going to keep them in honorable mention for now. Joining them is Blaz, who had some pretty good showings, most notably within North America, but doesn't really have anything to show for it. Hasn't played internationally, anything like that, but he has had some lights out performances, so I'll give him an honorable mention. And Joom, another one in the HMs, had some killer performances around his debut. He had, let me take a look at it, a 1.09, 1.33, 1.17 back-to-back stage 3 Jönköping EUL finals. The EUL finals aren't that significant because each team only played either 2 or 4 maps, so pretty small sample size, but still good showings. But then he followed it up with pretty lukewarm 1.01, 0.99, 0.99. Had he kept up his previous level of performance, I think certainly he'd be in the top 15, but he really fell off. So honorable mention only. And then finally, Tyrant, living in the shadow of Uzus and Solotov, but showing up sometimes, just on average, not, I think, enough of the time to crack into the top 15. He actually has quite a few, and I think more sub 1.0 ratings than above 1.0s. So I'll give him the honorable mention, mostly because I don't even know who else I would give the other honorable mention to. Let me know if you think someone else deserves to be there, but again, this is just sort of a loose thing rather than the more concrete top 15, which we'll now begin into. So number 15, I have Aces, and I think this one might be a little bit controversial. He's played less than a lot of the other players here recently, but he is historically a very good player. And maybe as a teammate or just a person, I don't know, maybe he had a few rough edges, maybe he worked him out. I don't know what the actual reason is that he departed the old Rogue roster, which is sort of now Koi, but he generally put up the numbers, and he has also done so on Wild since he's returned. Only played in stage 1 in the LCQ and didn't quite make it to the major through either of them, but still put up good numbers along the way. Some of his teammates had some good performances, but he was, I think, consistently the best player there. I'll give him number 15. At number 14, we have Shinka, one of the few hard support players on this list. And maybe the hard supports I have on here, they deserve to be higher, whatever the case. But it's just so hard to assess a hard support player versus a first entry player. All I have to work with mostly is the stats, and you can also, you could, if they have a ton of plans, maybe they get more credit if they have some 1vx's, if their team does this, it requires very deep analysis to actually compare them. Whereas if you just look at the numbers, it's basically impossible to do so. He's been very consistently good, though. Some really good performances that are getting a bit old now in stage 2, stage 3 in Jönköping. He had a 1.14 and then a couple of 1.15s. Really good stuff. And even his non-incredible performance, his sort of whatever performances, only once did he dip below a 0.9 rating, which I think is pretty solid as a hard support player, and that was all the way back in Charlotte, only a 0.87 rating. So again, as the hard support player, and the planter on such a consistent team. Wolves, so Shinka, P4, Bibu, and I guess Mowgli now, have been to more events than anyone else in Europe. All the majors, SI, played in Europe the whole time. They played everything that I'm considering here except for the SI qualifier because they were already qualified. So big credit to them there. You could maybe even move him up a few slots depending on what you value. Number 13, I have Joystick, and where is he? Yeah, Joystick. A big reason he's on here, he massively outshined his teammates in Copenhagen. He was the only player that really had a good performance. Everyone else not so great, but he also had a good showing in the regular stage. So where is he? A 1.01 in the SI qualifier, still getting his sea legs, but then a 1.12 in stage 1 and a 1.16 in Copenhagen. Again, so much better than everyone else. If one or two of the other players had played even close to his level at that event, surely they would have made top 8, maybe top 4. But we'll see what they do in the future. Joystick on land seems to be back. The Russian Cyborg might have returned. Maybe it'll be a fluke. So I think he has a lot of mobility. He could just completely drop off this list or move a lot higher depending on how he does in the next stage and potentially the next major. At number 12, I have Virtue. Another player that I feel like could maybe jump up a few spots. Reigning world champion, obviously, along with his teammates on G2. So a lot of credit there. And honestly, quite a few not super impressive performances recently from him, but a 1.06 rating, I believe, at SI, I think really seals his position this high up. As a second support player, like you're not expected to get crazy stats, more so than your hard support player, but you get the idea. 1.06, winning the event on the roles he plays, just big stuff. 0.88 and then 0.94 in stage 1 in Copenhagen, not great, but again, as a support player, not hard support player, but support player nonetheless, you don't expect that much. But going back, he does have some good showings as well. Charlotte, a 1.05, stage 2, a 1.1, Berlin also a 1.1, so he's proven that he shows up on LAN, I guess even a lot more so than he does within EU. So is that just playing on LAN? Is that with the added pressure other players crumble and he doesn't? Whatever the case, some good showings from him, and I think most notably of all, that 1.06 at SI winning the event. And then finally in this tier, I have at number 11, it's Brede, and I think this is the final hard support player on the list, yeah. A few more flex or like second support type players, but from here on out, it's going to be mostly fraggers. Brede, maybe the best support player of all time, and in recent times, not as impressive as he was in the past. It was really, for a long time, him and Shaiko, the two that really showed up, and Alems sometimes joining them, usually Renshiro and Rafal lagging a bit behind. But as a support player, he put up his frags and also got down the bomb and also clutched out rounds, and it just increasingly is, I think support players are... Okay, so recently support players are in fewer and fewer positions to actually get their frags. That, it sort of explains his trend. But if you do look very recently, he's been quite good. 1.06 in stage 1, 1.15 in the LCQ. And I'm probably going to reiterate this for the other BDS members. They did well in the LCQ statistically, but they didn't even make it to the final, if I remember correctly. They lost to like Wild, but they padded their stats, I guess, along the way, but they didn't make it to the major is the ultimate thing, even if they had good numbers there. Proven that he could show up, but it didn't necessarily help his team win the whole LCQ there. So a legendary support player, and I think this might even be an underrating, but do let me know what you think about that. All right, moving on to the top 10. At number 10, I have Bibu, and honestly, I feel like a few of these players could maybe be above him, but he's had some incredible performances that are, as a few other players as well, are getting a bit aged now, but a 1.24 in stage 2, a 1.21 in stage 3, and a 1.17 in Jönköping. Him and Shinka, as the two support players on Wolves, were really popping off in that period of time. A little bit less at Berlin, but in stage 2 and then stage 3 in Jönköping, really good. Terrible rating in the EUL finals, but again, it's only over like 2 maps, so whatever. And then recently, in the LCQ, 1.1 rating, and Copenhagen, 1.06. I'm giving him and Mowgli, I think, a lot of credit, and I guess Shinka as well, because they did well in the LCQ, and I guess Shinka did a little bit less well, but especially Bibu and Mowgli, they did very well in the LCQ, and they qualified, right? They qualified for the major, so they showed up when it mattered, put up good stats, won the thing, went to the major, maybe didn't quite live up to their expectations, didn't make it out of the Swiss portion, but still, decent showing compared to a lot of the other teams at the major, and Bibu personally. So historically some really good stuff, and then recently some pretty good stuff, some impactful play. So I'll give him number 10 there. Okay, and then at number 9 we have Cryan. I feel like the next few players are interchangeable, maybe Cryan and the next two above him. So Cryan, I think a little bit opposite of Virtue, where he's incredible. He's like always really good within region, but then he falls off a little bit internationally. But I don't know if that's completely fair to say, because the only events he's been at recently, Berlin, which he won, and SI. But SI, I think, is a little bit damning. His team went pretty far, but he put up a 0.96 rating, so not crazy good. But again, the team had a decent showing, and then Berlin 1.05 rating, so maybe the other players on his team were showing up a little bit more. They were picking up the slack, whatever the case. I especially note the fall off because, again, his stage 1, or rather his stage performances, 1.25, 1.16, 1.13, 1.2, all really, really good. Everything above 1.1, a couple at 1.2 or higher. And then his most recent showing, stage 1, 1.2, and then the LCQ 1.15, also didn't make it through the LCQ, so didn't go to the major or anything. It looks like Koi is restructuring. They're changing out a few of the players. Maybe Cryan will get a little bit more backup in the frag department, but really, really good stuff across the board, winning a major in the last year, and then a little bit of a letdown at SI, but not like a terrible performance by any means from him individually. Okay, and then number 8, I have Doki, and same sort of thing as Virtue. I suppose you can move him up depending on what you value. Recently won SI, so the reigning world champion. There was a major since then where he fell a little bit flat, or I guess G2 did. He did pretty well. But, you can't knock the fact that they just won SI, and he's been really good recently. If we were just looking at like SI and stage 1 and maybe LCQ in Copenhagen, he would be much higher on this list with a 1.12, 1.16, and 1.08. All phenomenal stats. Hasn't really missed a beat, but he does have a few blemishes if you go back farther. A 1.07 and 1.13 in stage 1 and 2, but a 0.93 and a 0.9 in Charlotte and Berlin. So it seems like either he figured something out individually, or the meta changes favored him, or probably more likely the change from Citizen to Benja and the addition of Fabian and Titan to the coaching staff really benefited him. That's what I would imagine it is. But again, maybe he just sort of is hitting his stride, because really good stuff recently, and I think if he keeps this up, he could definitely rise pretty far through the rankings. Number 7, and I feel like this one might be a little bit controversial to have him, especially above Doki, but I'm giving Mowgli a lot of credit for what he does for the team. Wolves in the past, and before even they were Wolves, they're sort of a whatever team. Like sometimes they showed up, but they were never like incredible. Since Mowgli has joined, they've been such a consistent force, and I think Mowgli is such a big part of that. He gets in there and wins a lot of those entry engagements, but then if he wins those engagements, he also goes on to win a lot of the subsequent gunfights. He is so impactful in so many rounds. As the first entry, more aggressive than probably most players in the world, just does a really, really good job. And his stats are also very consistently good. He had a little bit of a slump around stage 3 through of last year through stage 1 of this year, but outside of that range, everything is at least a 1.1 rating. So stage 1, Charlotte, stage 2, Berlin, and then the LCQ and Copenhagen, all 1.1 or higher, a couple of ratings above 1.2. And especially 1.27 in the LCQ, they qualify, 1.15 at Copenhagen. So if we just look at the absolute most recent stuff, really, really good. Obviously, SI and stage 1, a little bit of a letdown, especially compared to those numbers. But the most recent thing being that good, I'll give them a lot of credit. So not anything to show for it. Cryan and Doki, they won a major and an SI, and then like Bride and some other players on here, they've also won a major. So no chips to show for it, but a lot of good showings to show for it, I guess you'd say. Moving on to the top 6 here. At number 6, I'm going to have Yuzus. I did this list originally, and I did all 50 players in EU, and it just wasn't that interesting. It's all pretty samey and uninteresting below like the top half or so. So I just decided to do the top 15 here. Originally, I had Yuzus at like number 3 or 4. He was, obviously higher than 6 and just a few places, but when you get this high up, those places are very significant. And it's not like he's even had a bad performance. I think he's just sort of been outshined a little bit by a few of the players at Copenhagen particularly, and especially most notably one of his teammates who we're going to talk about here in a little bit. Yeah, Yuzus, one of the highest floor players, one of the only players on this list, or just like in the world, I guess, to not go below a 1.0 rating within this window. He got a 1.0 in Berlin, a 1.05 in stage 3, a 1.07 in the UL finals, but everything else above a 1.2, 3 ratings at 1.2 or higher. Really good stuff, but his really good showings are his oldest showings. So a little bit of a knock on him there, but still a 1.15 at SI, a 1.11 in stage 1, and a 1.12 at Copenhagen. Lights out stuff. Like, just every player from this point on is pretty much inscrutable. But the only reason they're not like, number 1, 2, 3 is there are other players that exist that just have done better. Like, they just aren't really flawed, but other players have just been more impressive. But one of the most consistent players in the world, some of the highest highs, you can't really knock the guy. The only thing you could say about him and his teammates is that they haven't really placed the best. They've gone to a lot of events, but they haven't cracked past, I guess, top 8, right? So, we'll see what they do in the future. Seems like they're on a good path, but more work to be done, certainly. Now into the top 5, and at number 5, I have Likafak. Whenever I look at this guy and what he's accomplished, he just feels like he should be higher, but I don't know. I just can't, at the moment, put him above any of the other 4 players. You definitely aren't going to put him above, well, okay, we'll just continue on. I don't want to spoil anything. He joined the team. They went to Jönköping, and then they won the event. Simple as, Rafał got benched or, dropped, whatever you want to say. Likafak comes onto the team, they do really well in EU, and then they win the major, and then they win the UL finals dominantly. They also won Gamers 8 in there, which I'm not actually tracking. Then they go to SI, a little bit of a letdown, but still a decent performance from him and the team. And then stage 1 and the LCQ, also good showings by him individually, but they didn't make the major. Had they qualified for the major and he'd done well, I probably would put him higher, but I am giving a little bit of a knock there. But I mean, what can you say? His lowest rating, a 1.02, is at a major that he won. Besides that, everything above a 1.1. Debut performance incredible. And from my understanding, he's like co-IGL with Alems or the main IGL, or at least a really vocal player, something like that. So his impact is not just in the kills. So I mean, just if this guy continues on this trajectory, he'll be one of the greatest to ever play the game, if he keeps it up for a while. But anyways, into the top 4. Number 4, we have Alamau. He feels like he sticks out here because all of the other players around him, like the 5 players right below him and the 3 players that are going to be above him, they're all fragging players, and they're all like first or second entries, or maybe Crying, whatever. Sometimes they're like Flex, Lurk, or whatever. But like Mowgli, Doki, Likafak, Shaiko, Benja, Solotov, these are all first or second entries, like through and through. But Alamau has stats that can compete with them for the most part. He's also a world champion. He's also the IGL of that world champion team, and he's also a major winner, and that's before the period we're looking at, but I think it is relevant. One of the only players to win a major and an SI. So just like crazy achievements. And I think he'd be in the top 3 had he had a good Copenhagen. He had a 0.89 rating. If he'd done like a 1.1 rating, which is obviously pretty high, but by his standards, not that high. Had he done that, I think he'd easily be in number 3, but having a bad showing at the most recent major where his team fell a little bit short, top 8 is still good, but obviously going from winning SI to only top 8 is a big step down. Had he done well at Copenhagen, I'd put him higher, but still top 4, nothing to laugh at. Never going below a 1-point rating up until Copenhagen within EU, and you have to go really far back, even within Brazil, I think, to find a sub 1.0 rating. And he's not even on entry, right? He's like a flex IGL. Maybe he's getting aggressive sometimes, maybe more so than his roles would indicate he should, but just good stuff through and through. Really consistent player, especially on the roles he's on, IGL, flex, all this good stuff. Now the top 3. Okay, Solotov, he was like 6th or something on that previous list I made, but his Copenhagen performance so lights out, and some of the other players, technically even one of the players above him, recontextualized recently. Shaiko had a bad stage 1, but obviously he's still above him. He outshined Usus in Copenhagen by enough that I think he surpasses Usus. So comparing the two, Solotov, a couple of 1.11s into a 1.19 in Copenhagen, whereas Usus 1.15, 1.11, 1.12. But the floor on Solotov actually quite a bit higher too. His lowest rating being a 1.07, a better floor, a better lowest rating than any other player within EU, except for, I guess, Aces, who has only played Stage 1 and LCQ recently. So you probably don't even count that, chalk that up to small sample size. But Solotov, I guess the most consistently good fragger. Now that Shaiko put up a bad performance, like, you got to give the crown to Solotov there. Never going below 1.07, and still in every other, had a 1.07, 1.09, everything else 1.1 or higher. He even achieved a 1.2. So Usus has a few higher highs, but they are pretty old, as I said when I was talking about him, and just the most impressive player, I think, at the Copenhagen Major was Solotov, and that goes a long way. Combined with everything else, I give him number 3, but I just can't quite put him above the other 2 players. Benja, number 2. Shaiko, number 1. I don't know. Like, I think this might be a little bit controversial because if you're just looking at right now, Shaiko, really good in SI, 1.24 rating, insane, as always. And then 1.23 in the LCQ, didn't qualify for the major, 0.88 in stage 1. One of, if not just the single worst performance we've ever seen from Shaiko. It really hurts that it was recent and then also didn't even get to go to the major. But, okay, let's talk about Benja a little bit more first since he's next on the list. Okay, Benja, incredible player. I don't think you can put him below anyone else besides Shaiko. I don't think Solotov has done well enough to surpass him. Benja, the biggest reason that they won SI. You know, the new player, brand new on the roster, hadn't played with the roster in any other event. They won SI. He was the event MVP, one of the highest rated players at the event, highest rated player that was in the grand final. So a 1.19 there, a 1.18 in stage 1, and then a 1.13 in Copenhagen. Obviously dropping down a little bit in rating, but still very good stuff. I mean, you just can't knock the guy. The worst real rating he's had is 0.93 in Jönköping. He had a 0.63, terrible in the UL finals. But again, only 2 maps, whatever, you can just discount that. But comparing him head-to-head with Shaiko, Shaiko just has so many ratings, like so many ratings that are just higher than anything Benja's ever had. Shaiko has a 1.27, a 1.27, a 1.25, a 1.41, a 1.24, and a 1.23. 6 ratings, all higher than Benja's highest at a 1.22. I think that alone really speaks for things. If you ignore each of their worst performances, even if you ignore Benja's, you know, don't count the EUL and then ignore Jönköping for Benja, ignore stage 1 for Shaiko. The floor on Shaiko is a 1.15. The floor on Benja is still a 1.12, still pretty close. But I think I've illustrated the point. Shaiko, just historically such a good player. Benja doesn't really have history before this, so it's pretty hard to say. If he keeps this up and if he improves, maybe he'll take the king spot from Shaiko. I do think Shaiko is probably the best fragger the game's ever seen. Maybe you'd argue better players, more impactful, whatever, Canadian, Pengu, Palu, whatever else, but none of those are like as pure of fraggers as Shaiko is. Just the numbers this guy has put up on first entry. Again, it's just not an easy thing to do at the top level, at all these international events. Doing what he's done is incredible, and I think he definitely deserves number 1. But do let me know if you think it's Benja. The only other player I can maybe see is Alamau. Again, I'd have him higher if his Copenhagen performance was better. I think that hurts him to some extent, but I think it's possible that Alamau's the most valuable player in the world because of the attributes I sort of mentioned before. But okay, this video's gotten long enough, so I think I'm going to call it here. I'll go through the rankings one more time. Honorable mentions in no order. I have Dan, Shepard, Blaz, Joom, and Tyrant. And then from 15th place through 1st place, I have Aces, Shinka, Joystick, Virtue, Bride, Bibu, Cryan, Doki, Mowgli, Uzis, Likafak, Alamau, Solotov, Benjamaster, and Shaiko. And okay, so any comments, any of that sort of stuff, if you want to debate any of the stuff or ask me why I ranked anyone anywhere, feel free to leave that below. A like and a subscription would also be very much appreciated. And with all of that being said, I will catch you guys next time.